Early Americans built a national identity on the thing that they were trying to destroy, pretending to be Native, playing with these Indian symbols. At the same time, their government was literally rounding up and killing actual Indigenous people.
As we endure this year's surreal celebrations around the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, most of us know that what we've been taught is a Disneyfied version of what really happened those 2.5 centuries ago, as well as before, as well as after. Rebecca Nagle is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, award-winning journalist and author, and the host of the podcast, This Land. The day this episode airs, her new investigative podcast begins, a truly incredible series called First America that unveils the now seemingly invisible history of how the treatment of Indigenous nations and the Native resistance that followed helped shape democracy in profound and surprising ways, demonstrating how our current political moment is 250 years in the making. For this episode, we're focusing on the history of white colonizers playing Indian, and we'll hear stories about the costumes of the Boston Tea Party, Victorian-era summer camps for kids, symbolic 19th century political cartoons, the names and logos of sports mascots, and even a different kind of mascot for a certain recent insurrection. We'll talk about what this oft-forgotten history of both Indigenous peoples themselves, as well as colonizers' idea of Indigenous peoples, has to do with American identity, the concept of freedom, and most importantly, the feeling of envy, and how we can look to the past not just to find the roots of the present, but also to learn about potential paths to political resistance. I'm your host, Chelsea Weber-Smith, and this is
very
American
excited for this
Hysteria.
one, everyone. I am really honored that our guest today is here to talk to us and teach us a lot of things that we should know, but for some inexplicable reason, do not. So welcome, Rebecca. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Osio naga gohin dawato. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Nagle. Jalakayetli Gela. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. And yeah, I'm the host of a new podcast called First America.
A fantastic new podcast that I have had the privilege of listening to the first 3 episodes. And I've been stunned. I've been really stunned by it. I mean, it's not only a great podcast, but it is so, I'm always humbled by the things that I don't know, despite the fact that the only thing I really do all day is study U.S. history. And yet, even when you feel like you are looking for the history under our Disneyfied revisionist history that we've been presented our whole lives, you still miss these major things. And that is really something that your show has shown me yet again. So it's fantastic. And I was really hoping that we could just start with you kind of telling us what you set out to do with this show, and then how your mission and your perspective and kind of the thesis focus ended up changing.
Yeah, totally. So when I started out, I thought I was making a history podcast. And so, I did all the things. I talked to scholars and historians. I went to Yale.
Of course.
I read books. And what would happen is that I would be out doing these reporting trips about America's past. And then in these eerie ways, the same thing would be happening in our present. And so one of those trips, I was with a historian named Nick Estes, who's a citizen of the Lower Burrell Sioux tribe. And we were visiting this place in Minneapolis called Fort Snelling, which is a historic fort. There's a replica of the fort there now. But in the 1860s, it was actually a concentration camp for Dakota people during the Dakota Wars. And so that day, Nick got a call on his phone from his wife that ICE had shot and killed someone. This was during the ICE surge in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. And we were there the day that Renee Good was killed. And so I kind of like canceled my flight home the next day and decided to just stay on the ground in Minneapolis for a couple of days and report on what was happening. And then the very next morning, I was back on the Fort Snelling campus, but not to visit a historic fort, to visit actually a protest, because ICE is headquartered in that area. And so people were protesting ICE and trying to block the street where they come in and out with the vans that they would use to detain people. And the building was where they were detaining people in Minneapolis. And ICE is there because it's federal land, and it's federal land because it was once a military reservation to control Indigenous people in the area. Right. And so not only is the same thing happening in the same place, but when you dig into the legal reasons as to why or how is our government able to do this? How is ICE able to do this? How is the president able to do this? It really goes back to what our government did to Indigenous people. And so, a lot of the podcast is taking things that we thought we knew about, like the Declaration of Independence or the Boston Tea Party, these stories that have been told over and over again about America's founding, and kind of telling the part of the story that's been left out. But then I think what happened to me that was surprising is that left out story actually explains where we are today as a country and how we got here.
Yeah, absolutely. You talk about this idea that we kind of have as authoritarianism as we see it today is happening all around us. We have this story like, this can't happen in America, or, we need to go back just a few years before Trump and before this authoritarian surge. But your podcast explains that there was no time before, right? And I think that idea is extremely important. I think that many of our listeners understand it, but I do like that you say that your podcast is like our current political moment that is actually 250 years in the making. Is there any other time that you really felt that so far in terms of you studying something and that parallel just popping up almost in this surreal way?
Yeah, I think in this moment when we're experiencing this rise in authoritarianism, it's really scary. There's this, I think, very natural, very human instinct to want to go back to a time before, to think, if we can just rewind the clock, 10 years, that we can get back to a time when things in America were okay. And I think you see this even on the left with things like the No Kings protest, right? This idea that our founders didn't want to be tyrants. They were saying no to monarchy, yes to democracy. And that's, the story of America. And what I was surprised to learn, digging into this history, is that actually democracy is only half the story of the type of government that our founders created. They did, build a democracy with things like local, state, federal government, elections, 3 branches, checks and balances. But they also built this arm of the American government that actually didn't have those things. Yeah. It didn't have elections, didn't have accountability, it didn't have checks and balances. And that part of our government, I think, is most easily called empire, right? And so when the founders were looking west over a continent that was, controlled and governed and occupied by hundreds of indigenous nations, they decided that they were going to take that land by force. And they had to build a government to do that, right? Like they had to build systems and governments to do that. And what the podcast really argues is that that's the root of authoritarianism in our country, that actually part of our government has always ruled through force, has always ruled in a top-down way. And what Trump is doing isn't new and isn't un-American and isn't unprecedented. He's just taking parts of our government that for a long time were kept at the margins and pulling it into the center. And actually, it's one because we've let these weaknesses in our democracy stay, just sort of like grow and fester. Trump is able to sort of push on those weaknesses. You know, the way I think about it is that Indigenous history almost set these fault lines in American democracy. And what we're living through right now is the earthquake.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I think another really good example of all the things that you're talking about was that particular part of the Declaration of Independence that I did not, it's like, how do I not know about this? Could you talk about that before we get into some of the stories that we're going to tell today?
Yeah, totally. And so for people, I think we hear, all men created equal. Like we hear these lines from the Declaration of Independence over and over again, but I think it's just good to give context. So the Declaration of Independence happens, we're a year into the war, right? So the violence has boiled over into war. There's actually been some overtures towards the King of England towards peace. And, he was so bitter and mad. He, didn't even read it. He rejected it. And so the founders are coming together and they kind of need to do two things. One, they need to say on kind of a world stage to other European powers, like, we're justified in this war. We're justified to throw off the king. But the other thing that they need to do is, I think a lot of times as Americans, we don't realize this, but that the revolution was also kind of a civil war. Like not everybody who lived in the colonies wanted to get rid of England, right? People were really divided. And so the founders also needed to convince regular people that this king that they've been the subject of for generations is a bad guy and that they actually need to take up guns and fight for independence. So they need to inspire people to fight and win a war. Mm-hmm. And so when you read the Declaration of Independence, there's this whole preamble where, then that's where you get the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness part. But then the actual meat of the document is just this list of grievances against George. And I kind of think about it as a breakup letter. It's kind of like our founding fathers are breaking up with their mean boyfriend, the King of England, right? Because it's like that part of a breakup, or at least every bad breakup, where you tell the other person everything they did wrong, right?
Yep. You nail it on their front door.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's like that angry email that the next day you're like, oh God, what did I send?
But it's enshrined in our history and is the document of which, through which we make so many decisions. So
yeah.
Yes.
And so when you get to the meat of the document, that list of grievances, a lot of historians argue that the list has an order, that basically it starts with smaller things and it crescendos and kind of builds to the thing that the colonists were the most angry about. Mm-hmm. And the last complaint has a racial slur in it. It calls Indigenous people merciless Indian savages and said, that the king has excited them and that, they talks about our warfare. And it's basically about Native people. And so it's just one of those things where the story that we have been told about that document for centuries, right, is different than the story that the document tells, right? Because we've been told this story that the revolution was fought over taxation and representation. And then when you read the document, the thing our founders were actually the most angry about was Native people. And so just how did we all miss that?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's, of course, we can always say it's by design, but it's just very strange. I was so shocked to hear that. And then I was shocked at my own shock, right? Which I'm sure is something that you're experiencing to some degree. It's bizarre. I'm so glad this is coming out as we're going into this totally bizarre world of the 250th, anniversary and UFC fucking fighting on. It's just, it's baffling. It's the most incredible, WrestleMania that we could have created. And maybe that's the new part, but not the authoritarianism. But I do think that us telling some of these stories is going to be really interesting to our audience. And I know that one that I would love to start with is another one of those heroic American tales that we tell about the Boston Tea Party. Can we go back and look at that story through the lens that you've been looking at it through?
Yeah, totally. The Boston Tea Party is one of the most famous events leading up to the Revolution. It is about taxes.
Sure.
But what's funny is that Native people, in a weird and surprising way, are part of this story too, but we've been left out of how it gets told. And this was something that I was really surprised to learn. And I learned it through this scholar named Phil Deloria, who wrote a book it's an amazing book.
And he's so good on the podcast too.
Yeah, he's incredible. And his book is called Plain Indian. I highly recommend it to anybody who hasn't read it. But what I learned is that when the colonists stormed the ships to throw tea in the harbor, they dressed up like Native people. They put on Native costume to do that.
It's wild. How do we not know this?
Yeah. And just to back up, because I think even when these stories are, kind of really famous, like the crossing of the Delaware or whatever, it's funny that I feel like as Americans, we often don't actually know like what the details are.
Yeah.
And so with the Boston Tea Party, what's happening is that, the city is kind of boiling with anger. There have been these laws where there have been taxes and other things that the colonists don't like. And then when people protest, the king is kind of just tightens the screws. And so there's the Boston Massacre where soldiers actually shoot protesters in the street. So after all of that has happened, there's already this high level of tension. Then comes the Tea Act. And so the tea basically gives this one British company a monopoly on all tea that is sold in the colonies. And so it would put some merchants out of business. And also for every pound of tea, the colonists have to pay a 3 pence import tax. So they're going to have to pay an import tax on this tea. And then to add insult to injury, the tea that is being sent to the colonists has been in a warehouse for years and is actually moldy. It's gone bad. So they have to pay an extra import tax on this bad, moldy monopoly tea. And there are 3 ships docked in the Boston harbor, right? And basically, once the ships get unloaded, the tax has to be paid. And so there have been like these series of meetings. People are sort of going back between the meetings of folks in Boston and these public officials who can say what's going to happen. And then, like the last night before this deadline of when the tea has to be unloaded, they get word that the public officials aren't going to cut them a break and that they're saying that the tea has to be unloaded. And so that's when a crowd of people gather and decide to storm the ships and throw the tea into the harbor.
Right. And I mean, there was, from what I learned from your show, there was kind of a jovial feeling happening where it was like, taking this action and it felt, you talked about how it was the Boston Tea Party in a way, which I thought was so interesting.
Yeah, totally. It's not the Boston Tea protest, right? It's not the Boston Tea riot. It's the Boston Tea Party. And that weird thing that doesn't feel quite like they should all go together of protest, party, riot, property destruction, actually goes back to this thing in medieval Europe called misrule.
Yes. And I mean, that's something we've talked about on our show in so many different capacities, this inversion that can happen that helps to kind of blow off this class-related steam. So that this is something we're familiar with in totally different contexts. So it's great that it's coming back up again.
More after this. And now back to the show.
Yeah. So the costumes that the protesters put on is they put on blankets. So even at this time, kind of blankets are associated with Native people. And then they used lamp black, which is basically soot to darken their faces. There's mixed accounts, and I heard different versions. Some people will say that they put feathers on. Other people will say that that didn't happen. And they even attached a specific tribe to what they claim to be. So they claim to be Mohawks. And I think sometimes people think that it's for disguise, that maybe British officials would blame the Mohawks and not the Boston people, right? But that's kind of not what was going on. Anybody who knew people in Boston kind of knew who threw the tea overboard. So it wasn't really a secret. So it wasn't for disguise. It was actually because of what the costume of dressing up like a Native person symbolized at that time in America.
Can you talk about what it symbolized to them?
Yeah. So, and I think it's good to back up and explain the thing about misrule, which is that there was already, so before Europeans get to the New World and have the colonies and have this thing, there's already this thing in Europe where to riot, you would put on a costume, which is so funny and weird to think about. But we kind of have like versions of this today. Like it's
like the Portland frog. Remember that?
Yes.
So it does still exist. Yes.
Yeah, totally. But Halloween, Carnival, Mardi Gras. And so think about these days where it's kind of about inverting the social order and, everything gets flipped upside down. So, there'd be Pope Day or things like that. And so sometimes these events where people were sort of stepping out of the social order, sometimes it would look like a party, but then other times it would look more like protest or riot. So at this time in Europe, laws are like super, super harsh. So, the punishment for, killing a deer in the King's Forest is death, right? And so people would hunt in protest of these laws, but they would put on costumes to do it. Mm-hmm. And so, you might gang up on a community might gang up on a sheriff who's come into town to enforce one of these laws that they see as unjust and unfair. And they would put on a costume to do it. So men would put on women's dresses, sort of all about inverting the social order. And sometimes these events in Europe were kind of almost like a pressure release valve, kind of a way for people to blow off steam. But then they would sometimes teeter on riot or even rebellion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is, a strange balance for those in power too, because it's like there was some degree in my what I've studied around this, there was some degree of acceptance around this because it was like, well, if we let the poor people just have their little inversion festival, then, it'll help us maintain control because that pressure valve is released. But then when you get people together in this way, inevitably there's going to be some kind of desire to push back harder than what's allowed in this context, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's this weird, it's got this weird duality to it where there's a way that it disrupts or inverts the social order and it's, people are breaking the rules, but then the way that it's contained also reinforces those rules because it's like, okay, we're going to break the rules for this day or this night. And then everything, in the morning, everything will go back to normal. So if you think about kind of, after Mardi Gras comes Lent.
Right. That's a good example. So how does this fit into our Boston Tea Party story?
So by the time Europeans get to the United States, they have this centuries old tradition of, if you're going to riot, if you're going to throw tea into the harbor, we know that we put on a costume to do this. This is a thing that, people have been doing. But what happens with these protests when they get to America is that actually the costume changes. And so instead of dressing up like women, people start dressing up like Native Americans. And so the first incident of this is actually before the Boston Tea Party. The power that England holds on a global scale, right, is basically the Navy, right? They've got all these ships. The ships move fast, blah, blah, blah. Their Navy's really powerful. That's how they become a global empire. And so they have this big problem, though, is that they chop down all the trees in England, right? Mm-hmm. And ships, you need a mast. And the best thing for that is a very tall, very straight tree. And so they passed this law that in the colonies, very tall, very straight trees are for the crown and you can't use them for yourself. And so there are these kingsmen who have come to, I believe it's Massachusetts, to enforce this law. And they're staying at an inn. And it's like in the early 1700s. And this group of quote unquote Indians storm the inn, like hit them with clubs, like basically run them out of town. They're afraid. They're getting beat up, and they run to their ship and try to escape on their ship. And they get out away from the dock, and then they realize that their ship is taking on water because the protesters have punched a hole in the bottom.
Oh boy.
And people call it the mast tree riot, like mast, like the mast of a ship. But that's like one of the first documented incidents. But it's this thing that kind of carries over from Europe where, okay, we're going to protest these laws that we see as unjust, and we're going to do it in this weird kind of folksy way where we put on a costume. But now the costume that we're going to put on is going to be Native people.
Right. And something you talk about is that in a kind of surprising way, what was being represented, at least partially, was this idea of freedom.
Well, and you have to think about where the colonists are coming from, right? So in England, it is illegal to hunt. It's illegal to chop down wood. In a time before electricity, it is illegal to go collect wood in the forest and build a fire. To landing in North America, where you can go hunt if you want to. There are plenty of trees. There's plenty of wood. And so there's this way that in a very material way, North America becomes this land of freedom and abundance. And Native people kind of start to represent that. And there's another thing that's happening where it's idealized. And I think that Europeans have a very maybe not realistic idea of what it actually means to like live as a Native person.
Yeah.
But looking out, from Plymouth Rock and thinking about all the rules that you have to follow and how restrictive your life is in Puritan New England, to seeing Native people and how they're living, you can see how the colonists would see Native people as actually having more freedom. And so as early Americans are working out these ideas around freedom and liberty and even American identity, Native people represent it. That's the symbol that carries those ideas for the founding generation of America.
So there's this crazy tension between this way that colonizers are viewing Native people as something to despise, and yet there is this underlying current of there's so much to envy, which I imagine played a role in so much of what we've seen over the last, several hundred years.
Yeah, and that's kind of the dynamic. And we can talk more about like present day examples, but I feel like that's actually still the basic dynamic that's going on today, where there's this, I call it, the Indians of white people's imaginations, but there's sort of this cartoonified version of Native people that's really held up on a pedestal, right? That's idealized, that's an object of desire that people want to become. But then there's actual Native people, like living, breathing in the flesh Native people. And we don't get all that love. And so for the founding generation, right, you can see that tension in the way that Native people symbolize freedom and symbolize liberty. And then we're also the merciless Indian savages of the Constitution. And so early Americans did this pretty wild thing where they built a national identity on the thing that they were trying to destroy. So they built a national American identity on pretending to be Native, playing with these Indian symbols. At the same time, their government was literally rounding up and killing actual Indigenous people. And that dynamic goes back to this like big idea called settler colonialism.
Right.
So like when you think about classic colonialism, right, it's a lot of what England did around the globe, right? So England, if you think about a place like India, you know, the British people who go to administer colonial India aren't trying to become part of that country, right? Like they go back to England. But settler colonialism, like what we have here in the United States, Canada, other places, is different because instead of going back to England, settlers came here to stay. And early Americans were in this really awkward and uncomfortable place where they weren't still British. You know, they were saying, you know, we're not British. We're rejecting the king. We're throwing off the monarchy. We're saying no to England. But they also weren't yet American. And so they needed to find a way to claim that they belonged, right? That they were of this land, of this place. And playing Indian, literally pretending to be native, is the thing that got them there. It's sort of the bridge that got us to a new national identity.
I mean, that was one of the revelations that was so stunning to me. Like one of the conclusions that you drew in the series so far. And what you connect it to in terms of the present day is everybody's favorite guy, the QAnon shaman, who became kind of the most potent symbol of January 6th in such a similar sort of iteration of the same thing. Can you talk about can you just talk about the comparison there?
Yeah. So like everybody else, I was on Twitter when January 6th happened. And I remember, I was just sitting and I was scrolling through Twitter, just kind of in shock, what's happening? It was like lawmakers were tweeting that they had barricaded themselves in their offices. It was just scary. It was a moment where it felt like there might not be a peaceful transition of power, which felt really scary. And then I saw this guy, right, with like bare chested, feather. Actually, I don't think it had feather. It was fur with horns. He had a spear. I mean, face paint on. He's now known as a QAnon shaman. He's actually like a Make America Healthy Again influencer now. I think he's a Maha influencer. But he's dressed up as a Native American to storm the Capitol. And kind of the photos of him, I think especially like standing behind a desk in the Senate chambers are some, I think, of the most like famous or iconic photos of that day. Yeah. Right.
Definitely.
And there are a lot of parallels, right? And there are some parallels that are really obvious, right? Like it's a riot, kind of like the Boston Tea Party. They're protesting what they see as unjust. It's kind of this self-fashioning of government, right? So it's this idea of taking matters into your own hands and obviously dressing up like Native people to do that. But I think there's also this parallel that's something actually deeper, that's part of the American character that's almost like subterranean, subconscious, right? I think it's something that we don't see at the surface or that we maybe aren't aware of. Because for me, the thing that was most confusing about January 6th and everything that happened is that to me, the rioters were destroying the thing that they claimed to be upholding, right? Mm-hmm, and so they are claiming to be fighting for American democracy, right? But they're like trying to overturn the results of a democratic election, right? Yeah. They claim to be fighting for American democracy, but they're storming the Capitol building. And then once they got inside, they trashed it, right? Like they broke stuff. Like they like filmed themselves breaking stuff.
And they kind of had a party.
Yeah, totally.
Which I hadn't thought about until this moment, is that it had a party vibe.
Totally. I mean, it's that thing of like, inverting the social order. Like it totally has the same vibe. I think that confusion of how can these people claim that they're fighting for defending American democracy at the same time that it feels like they're tearing it down or trying to destroy it. Our founders did the same thing. They built a national identity on playing Indian at the same time our government was killing actual Native people. So they built a national identity on the thing they were trying to destroy. And so I think that that kind of weird contradiction or dualism or tension that right now feels like a rupture in our country is actually, it's actually always been there.
Yeah. The parallel is just so wild to see. And to imagine that part of the choice that man made in the costume that he would put on for this January 6th party probably came from this idea of freedom that was baked into that, the stereotype that we would then use to assert that idea back to the country itself. So it's pretty wild. I don't know for sure that that's what he was thinking, but it's hard for me to imagine that wasn't part of that choice.
Well, and I think when you think about, so the way that early Americans symbolized freedom was in the symbolic Native person. And they imagine Native people having this kind of freedom that we didn't have, because what the colonists wanted wasn't the kind of freedom that Native people had. Because I think we lived in more just and equal societies than Puritan New England, and I think you could argue more democratic, more participatory and stuff, but there were still rules, right? Like it wasn't anarchy, people still had obligations to their family, their clan, their tribe. You couldn't just do whatever you wanted, right?
It wasn't individualism.
Exactly.
Not that type of freedom. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the kind of freedom that the colonists are imagining for themselves through the symbolic Native person, it doesn't actually exist, right? And so I think that is part of the DNA of America too, where we're always sort of stretching for this complete anarchical freedom with no consequences. And you can't live in a society and have that kind of freedom. And I think that kind of tension, all of these are points that Phil makes in his book, but this is one of the points that Phil makes in his book that really hit me hard, was that we've always had in our country that contradiction between the desire for law and order and then this desire for this sort of freedom with no consequences, individualistic, I get to do whatever I want. And again, it's sort of that stuff is there at the founding, and the way the founding generation is working that out is by dressing up like Native people. That's so weird.
I guess some things change, but most things just stay the same. That's definitely something I've learned again and again making this show. So another thing that you talk about that was very kind of potent to this greater idea that we've been talking about are the political cartoons of the time. So can you give us an overview of what those were like?
Yeah, I learned this through reading Phil's book, Plain Indian, and it blew my mind. In political cartoons during the Revolutionary era, there'll be white people, white men, white women will represent England. It's sort of, how in political cartoons, like people stand in as different symbols for things. So white people will represent England. And then to represent the colonies will be represented in these cartoons by a Native woman. And so there's this famous example of this that is one of my favorite examples. It's called The Female Combatants. And it's this white woman and kind of like, think of the kind of Bridgerton. It's not that era, but sort of like that kind of big dress thing. And she's boxing a Native woman who's, got like feathers in her hair and it's topless and sort of just a stereotype of that. And England is saying, I will force you to obedience, you rebellious slut.
I can't believe that. Yeah.
It's kind of a wild. It's kind of, you're like, wow, people in the late 1700s were weird.
Yeah. And they were saying slut.
They were saying slut. And the Native woman in the cartoon, she does not represent Indigenous people in North America. She is a stand-in for the colonists. And so the colonists are symbolized by a Native woman. And actually, like, a Native woman symbolizes America, like, into the 19th century. She's and that figure of a Native woman, it's eventually replaced by the figure of Columbia, which is a white woman. You can kind of think of like the Columbia Pictures lady.
Right.
But at first, of the founding generation, the symbol of who America is in these cartoons and in a bunch of different places is a Native woman.
Man. And why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the stuff we're talking about where early Americans have to say we are different and we are separate from England. Like, we are no longer English. We are no longer British. We are this other thing.
Yeah.
And they're working out this identity in between being, obviously they are not Indigenous. They're not Aboriginal to North America, but they're trying to work out an identity between those things where maybe they're a little bit Aboriginal to North America. They at least want to say that they are of this place and that they belong here. And casting themselves as Native in these symbolic ways is a way to do that, is a way to make that claim.
Yeah. And, it reminds me so much of some of the things, unrelated to your show, but some of the things we've talked about on our show of the ways that white people tried to even assert in magical terms that they were somehow here before the Indigenous people, right?
Yes.
Like, because there were giants that walked the earth. And that's what we thought some different types of bones were representative of, were these giants that were biblical. And so they were white and they were here first. So it's like we've been reaching for the same way to consider ourselves Native, and just in different ways, some more extreme than others. And that is just, it's wild. We just, the identity issue is such a big part of this, that lost identity.
Yeah, because the way I talk about it in the podcast is it's almost kind of what a serial killer would do in a horror movie, right?
You're speaking my language. Go on.
It's almost like you would murder a family, move into their house, and then pretend to be them.
That's exactly what it is.
And it's like, of course, America has an identity crisis. Like, that's what we did. You would expect anyone who lived in that house to lose their mind, to snap, And so, of course, we are seeing these big ruptures in American identity because it was built on this violent contradiction.
Absolutely. Oh, man.
More after this. And now back to the show.
The other thing that you talk about in the Playing Indian episode, another thing that I was blown away by, shocked that I didn't know, were these particular types of summer camps. Can you explain how those came about, why they came about, and what they were like?
Yeah, again, this is from Phil Deloria's book, Playing Indian. So how white people in America dress up like Native people goes through this big shift in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where white people are still dressing up like natives, but now they're doing it for a different reason, right? It's been 100 years since independence. We're not still like, oh, are we British? We know we're not British, right? But there's this other thing that's happened that makes Americans insecure in who they are. And that thing is modernity, right? It's industrialization. Mm-hmm. So instead of being rugged pioneers working on farms or living in cities, there's this fear that it's making children, particularly boys, effeminate and non-masculine. And that there's this idea that youth need to be more connected to, the nature and the outside world. Mm-hmm. And there's this one theorist of sort of child development that comes up with this idea that basically the stages of an individual person's development, right? From childhood to adolescence to adult, mirrors the development of human civilizations. And so kids have to go through a savage state before they become adults. Oof. And what represents that state better than Native people? And so, and it's actually interesting because there's this big summer camp movement And people are trying different things. So there's like one summer camp where they teach kids like military stuff and they're all like little soldiers. There are other ones where they're going to be pioneers and frontiersmen. And then there's this one where all the kids get dressed up like Native people. And then you can kind of see like how Boy Scouts grows out of the combination of those things.
Yes, very much.
So weird. And then also like Campfire Girls was just 100% was dressing white kids up like natives. So these things that we still have come from this era. And so, you know, they would like have the kids sleep in teepees and give them native names. And there would be sort of these orders and these chiefs and these made up words and these like ridiculous costumes that the kids would make. And then the other thing that happens in this time period is that we still have that dynamic of white people liking the sort of imagined cartoon version of Native people that they have in their head, but not actual Native people.
Yeah.
And what happens around this crisis around modernity and like, we don't know who we are, is that the authentic Native person that white people want to, you know, like tap into can only exist in the past. Because modern Native people are doing modern shit, right? You know, like modern Native people, they're driving cars, they're working in factories, like, you know, they have refrigerators. You know, we're not stuck in the past. But to find the authenticity in plain Indian that white people can't find in themselves, they have to play an Indian that exists from like 200 to 300 years ago.
Right.
You know, that Native person, that, you know, that noble savage that has like not been touched by history, you know, that sort of timeless exists in the past. And I would actually say, I think we're still in that dynamic, you know, like the Keewaydon shaman is not dressing up like Native people today, you know, like sports mascots or like tacky Coachella headdresses. You know, it's still kind of going back to that imagined past.
Yeah. I mean, I just think of even like that Lana Del Rey song, Ride, where she wears the big Indian headdress, you know, or that's what it would be called, I suppose, in this cliche way. And that was like her big, you know, I mean, everything's Americana, but it's like this big, like America song. And it's like, there she is, right? Doing the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's still a way that like when people want to represent like kitschy Americana, it's like the wooden figure of an Indian outside of the gas station. Like we've all been at that rest stop where to symbol, okay, we're really American. It's a bunch of Native stuff.
Well, right there on the main walk at Disneyland on Main Street, there's several like of the same types of those like cigar store versions of Native statues. And it's just, we're still there. It's Disneyland, you know? It's wild.
Not to mention anything about Pocahontas, you know?
Oh God, not to mention,
No, totally.
Okay, so these summer camps, when I was listening to your episode, it reminded me, and this is ridiculous, of this 90s movie that I only had a like very vague memory of, but then I looked it up, I was able to figure it out, and it was Man of the House with Chevy Chase and Jonathan Taylor Thomas. Do you remember this at all?
I have like a vague memory of it. Is it one of these like 90s movies where like the woman goes to work and then the man does domestic chores?
Maybe, because I only remember the one scene, but it does sound like that based on the title. It's a good guess. But there is a moment where Chevy Chase and Jonathan Taylor Thomas go to a summer camp that is this thing. Like they're dressing up like Native people. They're doing these ceremonies and then they get Native names. And I always remember the one Chevy Chase got was Squatting Dog.
Yeah.
And it was like, I just remember that so well. And that's the 90s. And it's there. I'm sure somewhere in this country, there are still summer camps. I mean, we know that like the native, the quote unquote, you know, nativized names that these summer camps still have. It's still happening. It's wild.
No, I mean, you see it like the Parent Trap, the camp in Parent Trap is like that. It's, you know, completely Native themed. Even watching Stranger Things there are 2 or 3 scenes in Stranger Things where people are dressed up like Native people. There's like a Halloween party, and then there's a scene where kids are just like running around in like feather headbands with like a fake bow and arrow. And it's just happening in the background. And so it's just like, even, you know, that came, like the last episode of that came out this past year, you know, it's still, you still see it everywhere.
Yeah. And I mean, another place we see it, of course, is in our sports mascots. And that had a tradition, quote unquote, that went back a lot longer than I expected. Do you want to get into that?
Yeah. So it's interesting because mascots start like around the same time, not that long after the summer camp thing happened. And I don't mean Native people and mascots. I mean, just the idea of mascots, just the thing of sports mascots, broadly speaking. And you get these Native themed mascots basically right from the beginning. And so even today, if you look at mascots across the United States, the top most popular mascots are knights, animals, and Indians.
Right.
Like where you still see it in professional sports is like the Kansas City Chiefs, the Atlanta Braves, the Chicago Blackhawks. And so they've decreased in number, and a lot of school districts and actually states have passed bans on Native themed mascots. And so the number has actually really decreased in schools. NCAA, the National College of Athletic, I actually don't know what the second A is for, but whatever. College sports.
Yeah, sure.
They've passed a ban where you can only have a mascot if it's connected to a specific tribe and if you're doing it with the tribe's consent. So that's why you still have the Florida Seminoles, but you don't have other mascots in college sports. Like the most offensive one is the old name of the Washington, D.C. football team, the R Skins. I'm not going to say the slur.
Yeah. And you did talk about, I mean, first of all, you talked about the impact that has and the studies that have come out about the impact that has on, you know, the actual Native kids, not the imagined Native kids that white people often create. But what are the effects that you found through your research?
Yeah, so there's this researcher named Dr. Stephanie Freiberg who looked at the impacts of sports mascots on Native kids. So she did this really interesting study where actually she showed kids images of Native people, and some of the images were things that were stereotypes like sports mascots. And then some of the other images were just, you know, like a Native person being a school teacher, a Native person getting groceries, just like a Native person existing in the world. And then she would ask the young people questions about how do they feel about being Native? How do they feel about themselves? And what do they see themselves being when they grow up? And the kids who looked at the mascot images had less pride in being Native, had lower self-esteem, and then also were less ambitious in what they thought they could be when they grew up.
Yeah.
And so it's like, it's really bad for Native youth. And that also held even if the kids said, I'm not offended by them.
Right. And that, I mean, one of the things you did was talk to some fans of the team we shall not name.
We went to a tailgate.
Yeah, you tailgated. And people really were willing to talk to you about their feelings around, you know, they wanted, as we know, like many of the fans did not want the name to change, do not want the names to change of the teams that still have some version of that type of mascot. But they kept coming back to like, no, we are honoring Native people. This is like an homage, or like there's no reason for this to hurt anyone because it's a tradition. That was a word that a lot of people used. So there's this misunderstanding, perhaps a purposeful misunderstanding, but still this idea that no, like, why are you looking at this so negatively when, you know, it's just part of a tradition? And that must have been a frustrating experience for you. But what was that like? And what do you think is underneath all of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, we're out doing the reporting The hardest thing about that day was how freaking cold it was.
Oh
It was
God,
so
yeah.
cold. I think it was 20 degrees or lower. It was December in Kansas City, so it was really, really cold.
People are dedicated. Yeah.
Yeah. And we went with we had met up with some super fans before who were really nice, invited us into their house. And then we actually went to the game with them, and they like gave me these like amazing foot warmers that aren't just the toe warmers, but that are like the shape of the sole of your foot. And those things are a game changer. Like your whole foot is warm. So that was
Thank
really
you for
helpful.
that PSA. Yeah.
But how it felt for me personally, I think in the day and in that moment, I was just there, just doing my job, being a journalist.
Yeah.
But then we flew through Chicago because we were still reporting, and we missed our flight because our incoming flight was delayed. And so I was running through the airport, and actually the song from Home Alone was playing. It's like before Christmas, so like Run Rudolph Run was playing. It was like this moment where I was like, what's happening? Anyway, then I was like running through that part of the airport. But the Chicago airport had done this thing where the Blackhawks logo, which if people don't know what it is, it's like a cartoon of a Native person's face with a lot of stereotypes of how you would draw a cartoon of a Native person's face. And so that symbol was like next to the gate numbers on some of the gates. And so I had to like look at it. And it was this moment that I was just boiling with anger. Because I think as an Indigenous person, you get used to it because those symbols are everywhere. And so you can't avoid it. You just have to kind of live with it. And I think you get used to it at a certain point. But then there's always something that's going to kind of pierce that tough skin. Yeah. And I think that moment, I just felt so angry. But yeah, I mean, I think for the fans who say that it's honoring Native people, I think that the Native people that they're honoring is that imagined version of Native people that don't exist, right? Like it's that Native person that's in their heads that's, noble and connected to the earth and lived 200 years ago, sort of, it's not actual contemporary Native people today. And I think even if you just look, Native people have been advocating for these mascots to get retired for literally decades. Yeah. And our voices constantly get drowned out of the debate around these things. And I think just that dynamic of Native people not being heard when they speak up about how these mascots are harmful, I think shows that point, right? That it's about the thing that it's honoring is the cartoon version of Native people. It's literally a cartoon version of our culture. It's not honoring actual Native people. And I think that split isn't conscious for most people. I feel like I get treated like this a lot too, where what people want in me or want to experience me as is like the stereotype that they have in their mind of Native people. And when I don't meet that, they get mad at me.
Right.
So it's just like...
Yeah, because they're still privileging a cartoon version.
Yes. And they want to connect to that version.
Right.
Like they want to tap into that version for whatever thing it is that they're looking for inside themselves.
Yeah. And that's what it is. There's some kind of need for self-definition. And this is one of the ways that we reach for that and do so very unsuccessfully and in a pretty harmful way. And it's pretty wild to see the precedent for this and to really start to get into that psychology and that sociology of like freedom and this self-definition of settler colonialism. I mean, these feel like you're getting to the heart of something. And this envy is something I've been thinking about so much, is like what envy does to people in power and how envy is enacted on the people that they subjugate. And it's just, I've been seeing this this is just an idea that keeps coming up. So this is so interesting because it does feel kind of like almost the original version of that, like the first version of that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we imagine like the map of the United States onto history. And what we don't realize is that at the founding, the colonists don't even control all of New York. They don't even control all of Pennsylvania. They don't even control all of Georgia. I mean, it's these settlements really hugging the East Coast. And the continent is controlled and governed and occupied by Indigenous people. And the colonists see a lot in how those Indigenous people are living that they want for themselves.
Right.
They want that land and they want that freedom for themselves.
Yeah. Yep. And we just see how that plays out in just tremendously harmful ways. Okay, so we've kind of got at, I think, the heart of a lot of what this idea of playing Indian has been. And I think now in this moment, it's the fucking 250th anniversary celebration. We're in it. We're in a moment right now. And
yes,
I think it would be nice if you felt comfortable just talking about, as you have wrapped this project up, what are you left with? Are you left with any kind of hope? Are you left with the way that you think that we should move forward? Like, if we can't go back, right? If we can't go back to a time when authoritarianism wasn't part of the American story, how do you orient yourself and find power to go forward?
One of the things I hear a lot of people doing in this political moment is looking to other countries. So looking to Nazi Germany or Hungary or other places that have seen the rise of fascism or the rise of authoritarianism to try and learn how do we survive it. And colonized people have already survived American authoritarianism.
Yeah.
We already have that knowledge. And so whether it's Indigenous people, whether it's people who, are from Guam or Puerto Rico or other places that we've colonized, or other people who live, at the margins of American empire, whether that's, migrants at our borders or victims of our wars,
Right.
And I think we've developed strategies on how to mitigate that harm and how to protect the things that are the most important for our communities. And we get to this in the last episode. Mm-hmm. So the last episode of the series, we kind of talk about how Indigenous resistance is different than how we think about fighting for other marginalized groups in the United States. So there's this legal scholar, Maggie Blackhawk. She's Ojibwe. She's also one of Phil's work. Her work is really foundational to kind of how we're talking about these issues. And one of the things that she says is that instead of using a rights framework, Indigenous people use a power framework.
Okay.
And so if you think about if you're fighting for rights, what are you going to do if your rights are violated? You're going to file a lawsuit. You're going to look for where does the Constitution protect your right? You're going to go to a court. You're going to, maybe you're going to petition Congress for laws that uphold your rights better. And Indigenous people do that. It's not that we never do that. But what we've done is work from a power model. And so what do you do when you work from a power model? Well, you build your own government. You build your own schools. You build your own hospitals. We have our own constitutions, And so what we're seeing right now in this political moment, I think, is the breakdown of the ways that we normally think that we can hold our government accountable.
Yeah.
Right? If you think about, okay, my rights have been violated, I'm going to sue.
Yeah.
Well, there's a couple things that make that harder right now. One is the moral appeal is out the window. Cruelty is the point.
Yeah.
The kind of these are human rights and we respect people. We are living in a moment where they're purposefully they're bragging about violating people's rights, right? I live in Oklahoma and the political ads are running right now. And I'm just at the gym watching TV, and every Republican governor, their ads are about how much they hate trans kids. And it's AI generated images of trans youth that don't actually exist, and how their platform for the governor of Oklahoma is that they're not going to let trans kids have access to medical care.
Yeah.
That's the Republican platform in Oklahoma right now.
Yeah. That's the whole platform. Yeah.
That's the whole, it's like Trump. I love Trump. I hate trans kids is basically what every ad is.
And I'm going to get all the immigrants, out of the country, maybe is the third
wing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that kind of moral appeal is we're kind of past where that's effective. And we're starting to get to the point where those rights appeals in the courts, in the legal appeals, are becoming less effective. And so I think it's an important moment for us to think about how do we push back against how power is used by our government? And I don't think that that's a place that most Americans are used to being.
No.
Right? Like, I don't think that that's a place where most Americans are used to experiencing, but Indigenous people have thought about this for a very long time. And like, we've come up with mechanisms to protect ourselves from some of the most harmful things that our government has tried to do. And some of those things are, building our own worlds. The other thing that we've done that I think is kind of brilliant from the perspective of our ancestors is where we have to interact with the US government. So like if you take the Bureau of Indian Affairs, where we have to kind of interface with the US government, a lot of times we take those systems over. And so right now we passed a law where the BIA has a hiring preference for citizens of federally recognized tribes. And so like now the BIA is over 80% Native.
Wow.
And so instead of having to go to a court to say, hey, the BIA isn't treating us the way that we want to be treated, we just took over the agency.
Right. And I imagine things get done quicker, more effectively, and with more equity. Yeah,
it's still complicated, but I think,
of course,
one thing that I think that we do as Indigenous people that I think would be helpful for everybody in this moment. I think as Indigenous people and as Indigenous nations, I think we instinctively think on different scales of time.
Okay.
And so, as Indigenous people, our timeline, it doesn't start 250 years ago, right? It goes back much further, but it also goes further into the future. And I think we're here today because generations of our ancestors made choices not for what was best for them, but what was best for future generations. And some of those choices they didn't actually live to get to see, but we have.
Right.
I think we're in a moment where everything feels extremely urgent. And it is. Like, it is so, like children are being harmed, people are dying. It is urgent.
Yeah.
But also, it took us a very long time to get here. It took us a very long time to get here. And it's going to take us a long time to get out. And I think that we have to plan and build for further down the road. And I think too, and this is another thing, is that I think if we think we can defeat authoritarianism in America with like one election or getting rid of one leader, it will be like pruning a weed and it will only grow back stronger. And I think we've actually already seen that happen between Trump 1 and Trump 2. It came back stronger.
That's right.
Losing that one election gave them time to regroup.
Right.
And so the root of authoritarianism in the United States, it's deeper than that. And Maggie Blackhawk, again, has this analogy where the way she talks about it is that it can feel scary, like right when the house is on fire, to think, okay, we gotta not just put the fire out, but we've gotta like actually break the house apart and rebuild it.
Yeah.
Because you can feel afraid that like, will it come back together again? But I think we have to have that understanding of how deep these issues are in our government if we actually really want to fix it.
And I think that's just a great place to wrap up our interview. This has been really, really great. I've loved talking to you. I've loved your podcast. I can't wait to listen to the rest of it. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to subscribe immediately and are going to learn so much like I did. And I just want to thank you for your work. I mean, this is quite an undertaking in every way. So congratulations and thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I love your podcast. I love American Hysteria. And so, I'm so excited to be on here and to be a guest. And I love all the work that you guys do to uncover everything from like aliens to other pieces of U.S. history. So it's great.
Oh, well, it often comes back to the same types of things that we're talking about today.
It does. It does. These dynamics play out in a lot of different arenas.
You just got to dig for it. So anyway, thanks again. I think we're definitely going to have you back whenever you'd like to come. So you let me know. And thanks again, Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you so much.
This was American Hysteria. make sure you go right now and subscribe to Rebecca's podcast, First America, as well as her other podcast, This Land. If you love our show and want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. You'll get ad-free episodes as well as bonus content, like the other podcasts that I make with our producer Miranda, where we tell you stories related to the topics that we cover and stories that we just know that you'll love. We have a huge back catalog, so if you subscribe right now, you'll have hours and hours and hours of different stories to listen to. That's patreon.com/American Hysteria or subscribe on Apple Plus. If you go to AmericanHysteria.com, you can pick up some of our merch. 100% of those profits go to the Samir Project, a Palestinian-led mutual aid group in Gaza. You can also leave us a message on the Urban Legends hotline about a tale that you remember from growing up or one you've heard recently, and we might do an entire investigation about it. American Hysteria's producer and editor is Miranda Zickler. Our associate producer is Riley Swedelius-Smith. This episode has additional editing by Kaylee Jasperson, and I'm your host, Chelsea Weber-Smith. Thanks, as always, for listening, and I hope you have a great